Cyberpunk 2077, much like its pen and paper predecessor, is set in Night City, a dystopian metropolis where violence and oppression are the norm and the boardrooms are equally as dangerous as the slums. But where is Night City? What major events shaped it? And how did a city designed as a crime-free utopia become one of the most dangerous places in the entire world? I'm going to answer all of those questions and many more as I welcome you to Night City. Night City is built on the bones of what we today know as Morro Bay, California, USA. However, in the world of Cyberpunk, the United States of America is a nation in name only. Around the beginning of the 21st century, a series of environmental disasters rendered the country almost unrecognisable, as rising sea levels put much of the east coast underwater and turned the south into a swampland. The Great Plains have become a desert, and the Midwest is battered by acid rainstorms. Leaking nuclear reactors have made entire regions uninhabitable, and plague has ravaged the population, killing off millions in just a few decades. The devastation was so widespread that the federal government was unable to maintain control, and it wasn't long before most of its power had evaporated. States began to govern themselves on a local basis, often completely ignoring the will of Washington, and some have even become entirely independent from the rest of the Union. In 2002, California became one of these so-called free states, and then in 2012, it separated itself even further into the free states of Northern and Southern California. And it's here, on the border between them, that Night City was founded. The city was the brainchild of businessman Richard Knight, formerly of the construction company Halsey, Ferris & Knight. However, he became dissatisfied with the work they were doing and broke off, forming his own company called Knight International. Knight International's end goal was to create the ideal city, a utopia free from crime and poverty that would be so grand that all other cities built before or after would be compared to it. He began raising the capital needed to bring his dream into reality, and luckily for him, the worldwide collapse of society had become rather lucrative for many wily business people. Following the collapse, numerous megacorporations were starting to look at establishing their own urban areas, with corporate-run city governments to avoid any anti-business elements that might otherwise interfere with their corporate growth. Knight's plan was tailor-made for their purposes, and he already had the construction capabilities within his own company. All he needed was the raw cash to get started, and he soon attracted investment from corporations like Arasaka, EBM and Petrochem. Construction began in the early 90s, predating California's independence by a few years, and thanks to Knight International's innovative building techniques, the centre of the city quickly took shape. However, this process had excluded the already established construction firms in the local area, many of which were controlled by organised crime syndicates. Knight began to receive death threats on a daily basis, and when these failed, the mobsters turned to sabotage and direct intimidation. Still, Knight remained steadfast, and with the backing of his corporate allies, many of these attacks were ruthlessly dealt with. However, eventually, just 4 years after construction began, his luck ran out, and Richard Knight was shot dead in his newly constructed penthouse. In memory of Richard, the city was renamed Night City. However, with him out of the picture, a power vacuum began to form. The corporations kept control of the city centre and the local government, but the mob took over the streets and the service industries. Both sides began to bring in outside help, sponsoring gangs to come in and fight for them, and before long, the once crime-free utopia was a war zone. By 2005, the mob had become the king of the hill, and the corporations retreated back to their penthouse strongholds. Truth be told, the corporations had little interest in really running the city, they just didn't want anything to interfere with their business, and without their support, the local government soon fell apart. The next 4 years became known as the Dark Ages of Night City, as the mob ruled with an iron fist and gang activity skyrocketed. The number of unsolved murders documented by the police rose into the thousands, and you were just as likely to have your car blown up as to have its radio stolen. This continued until 2009, when the corporations decided that they had had enough, and they went to war with the underworld of Night City. However, it must be understood that this wasn't about protecting innocence or even just basic human decency. This was business, and to them, the mob was nothing more than a rival corporation that was costing them money and not playing by the rules. Arasaka's paramilitary forces took to the streets, and through bombings, assassinations, and outright warfare, they utterly destroyed the mob's power bases in the city and decimated the street gangs. The corporations then took over, establishing a city council and security forces entirely under their control, and by the year 2020, Central Night City had healed from its rocky birth, and become the quintessential city of the cyberpunk future. Of course, the other defining feature of Night City and most American cities in the cyberpunk universe is the technology, which had been advancing at a rapid pace for decades. Cybernetic implants had become fairly common, and thanks to lucrative international trade, many megacorporations gained a staggering amount of power and wealth through the development of computers, weapons, and cyberware. However, in late 2021, this all began to come crashing down, as an event known as the Fourth Corporate War began. There were a lot of moving parts in the war, but to keep it simple, there are three major events that you need to know about. First, Arasaka and Militech, two massive megacorporations who both dealt in military hardware and security, went to war with one another and tore entire cities apart in the process. Secondly, as a part of this war, a legendary netrunner was murdered by Arasaka, and this triggered the release of the data crash virus onto the net, which promptly began to corrupt it at an alarming rate. And lastly, the war ended when a tactical nuke was detonated inside of Arasaka Towers in Night City, destroying much of the city centre and Arasaka's private, offline database of world secrets. The fallout from the war was catastrophic. Locally, thousands were killed, sections of the city were flooded, and although the bomb was planted on behalf of Militech, the US president put the blame for the explosion on Arasaka and instead nationalised Militech. However, on a worldwide scale, the corruption of the net and the huge amount of physical damage caused by the fighting resulted in massive issues for trade infrastructure. Many megacorporations went bankrupt as shipping became nearly impossible. The technology that people had come to rely on was becoming more scarce, and when a container of cyberware or computer parts was found, they were instantly purchased by the super wealthy. Even the corporations who managed to keep afloat still suffered losses, and their extreme levels of control and power over the population were diminished. Many key characters from the 2020 game also died during the war, including Johnny Silverhand, whose digital ghost will be accompanying V in 2077, although there are rumours his body may have been recovered and kept in cold storage. The corruption of the net means that worldwide networks are now a thing of the past, and the twisted remains of cyberspace now exist behind a digital barrier called Blackwall that only the bravest netrunners will ever try and breach, as they search for the secrets hidden beyond it, such as who really controls the money, the information, and the world. The period of time between the war and 2077 will be explored further in the Cyberpunk Red RPG, which will serve as a follow-up to the Fourth Corporate War. But now, let's take a look directly at what Night City will look like by the year 2077. 50 years later, Night City's various districts have been consolidated into 6 major regions. The city centre has recovered since the fall of Arasaka Tower, and remains the heart of the city and the home of the corporations. Its streets are clean and relatively safe thanks to the police and ruthless corporate security forces. Nearby is Hayward, a largely residential area filled with massive housing complexes that are like small towns of their own, but an underlying gang problem does plague the area. However, Hayward's troubles are nothing compared to Pacifica's. This region was originally intended to be filled with hotels and residences for the super wealthy. To save money on construction, the corporations building it hired cheap labour from countries like Haiti. But when their businesses went bust, the project was abandoned. However, by then, a series of tsunamis and tropical storms had destroyed Haiti. With the Pacifica project abandoned and no home to return to, the labourers were forced to settle in Pacifica themselves. But a steady rise in gang activity has turned the region into the most dangerous district in the city and an area of immense poverty. Watson was also once heavily controlled by a corporate giant. However, more recently, it's become populated by Asian immigrants, creating a unique mixture of cultures throughout its narrow alleyways, housing complexes, bazaars, and markets. Nearby Westbrook features the tourist-orientated Japantown, and is a playground for Night City's wealthy elite. Finally, Santo Domingo is the home of industry. The factories and power plants that keep Night City running are located here, and the entire area is stuck in an endless cycle of modernisation as they try to keep up with increasing demand. Regardless of which district you find yourself in, technology and cyberware will of course be a major part of the setting. However, the way people treat it has changed a lot since the early days of the city. As Cyberpunk's creator describes, in 2020 cyberware was kind of cool and fairly new. The cyberpunks were the only people really grabbing onto these advances in technology and holding on. But following the war, cyberware became much harder to access, and those who were using it treated it more like a tool, something used out of necessity. However, by 2077 cyberware is a fetish. It's about style again, but unlike 2020, when its users were limited, now everyone is mechanically enhanced. This is because by 2077, consumerism has started to build back up, as shipping infrastructure recovered around the world. As Mike Pondsmith describes, for 40 years you couldn't get what you wanted, and now for the first time in decades you can. But as consumerism rises, there are those looking to exploit it, and scavengers now kidnap and murder to steal cyberware, while corporations bombard you with advertising to buy their latest products. And that all leads me to the biggest theme of Night City in 2077, corruption. Whereas in 2020 it was more about inequality, in 2077 the public has regained much of their freedom, but the corrupt elite, criminal factions and political leaders are looking to take it away from them again, to exploit and oppress the masses for their own greed. The city blends all of these elements together, the crime and danger, the wealth and greed. It's a city that breeds corruption, from the gang-filled streets of Pacifica to the high-rise offices of the city centre. All in all, Night City is the ultimate embodiment of the dystopian cyberpunk future. It's a city living on the edge, and the only way to leave is in a body bag. Let me know if there are any other aspects of Cyberpunk 2077 lore that you would like explained. What about a full guide to the Fourth Corporate War? Or perhaps a look at the Soul Killer program, which was possibly used on Johnny Silverhand to create his digital ghost. There is tons of lore to dig into, so let me know what has you most excited. But for now, as always, I've been James for Fandom, and thank you for watching.